Well, of course, the big movie of this year, the big movie of the summer, has been the movie The Avengers. And based on the amount of money that the Avengers have made, I don't know if you realize it at this point, but at this point, the movie has made nearly $1.5 billion worldwide, if you can imagine that, which puts it third all time behind Titanic and, of course, Avatar. And so it's a big movie. It's been a huge movie. And so I'm assuming that from those numbers, at least most of us have probably either seen the movie or are aware of what it's about. And of course, The Avengers is a superhero movie. It's a big superhero movie, too. It's not just a superhero movie about one superhero, but like 5 or 6 different superheroes that get together and they form a team of superheroes. So it's like superhero exponentially growing and being powerful together. And so it's this ultimate superhero movie. It's an amazing, amazing movie. It's really good. And so as a result, like, people have taken notice, of course, and there's been these articles written. And I was reading an article recently about this movie in particular. And this guy who was a film critic, but he was also an actor. So he was taking it from an actor's standpoint. And he talks about kind of the superhero movie genre, where it's come from, when it started. And he starts way back in 1978 with, of course, the original Superman movie. And at that point, all of us who know Superman as Christopher Reeve, at that point, Christopher Reeve had been approached to take this role on. And he was fresh out of one of the greatest acting schools that you could be a part of in the world. And he was classically trained as an actor. And so as he came out of this classically trained background, a lot of his friends were making fun of him, his peers were making fun of him for accepting the role of Superman, because they viewed a superhero movie as a movie that was beneath them as classically trained actors, right? Superhero movies were just all about special effects and that sort of thing, and they had bad plot lines, and they didn't really afford much for the actor to really engage in the role and to be somebody who portrayed a dramatic superhero. And so as through that, and of course Christopher Reeve accepted the job, he accepted the opportunity to play Superman, and it became a career-defining role for him. And this author follows through, makes a great point, because he follows through all the way through this history of superhero movies, all the way to The Avengers that came out this year. And he talks about that a great superhero movie, all the way through, is a movie that actually presents our heroes that we see on screen as men and women who are flawed. Right? That they have certain flaws. In every superhero movie, if you think about it, at least the good ones that we've seen, the ones that really engage, it's the superhero starts out, he has this amazing power, or she has this amazing power, but she goes through this period of being flawed and going through failure, just like a regular human being. And so in many ways, our superheroes become much more human like us. And it allows and as he makes a great point, it allows the audience member to be able to engage in the story because they relate to us. Right? They're not just superheroes that are perfect all the way through. They make mistakes, and then in the end they overcome, and they're eventually victorious by defeating the bad guy or whatever it may be. And he lays this out, and he says he makes a great point by saying this, is that this is kind of indicative of almost every good story that you would see in any other kind of movie, not just a superhero movie. And so as a result, you've seen throughout the years, guys like big-time actors like George Clooney, big-time actors like Robert Downey Jr., he talks about Patrick Stewart, Ian McKellen, and other guys have played roles of superheroes throughout the years because they recognize how legitimized this genre has gotten. Now, I bring that up because this morning we're going to be looking at the second part of Genesis. We're going to be looking at specifically the second part of Genesis chapter 12 all the way through the end of the book, Genesis chapter 15. And as we look at it, what we're going to see is that Genesis presents us with the life stories of 4 important men that might be considered superheroes of the Bible. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. They're also known as the patriarchs. As we look at these guys all the way through the Old Testament and then even on into the New Testament, as we saw with Jesus' engagement with the Sadducees, the way that he got their attention was to talk about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Because the Jews throughout the Old Testament and then into the New Testament looked back to these guys as the superheroes of the faith. We're going to ask this morning as we look at this, what is it that makes them heroes? What is it that makes them heroes? We're going to see, I think, maybe an answer that we might not have thought of before, or at least not considered in the way that we're going to look at it this morning. And I think there's a fair amount of foreshadowing at the very beginning of Abram's story. When God calls Abram out of Ur, as we saw last week, right? He says, I am going to make your name great, as part of the promise. And that comes right out of the heels of chapter 11, Genesis chapter 11. When the people of the Tower of Babel had built this tower with the motivation, with the ambition of let us make a name for ourselves. And you see a direct contrast between that. The difference between making a name for ourselves versus humbling ourselves before God and allowing him to do what he's going to do. And I think as we read through the story, we're going to see that these men struggle with the very same thing. This temptation to make a name for themselves and to do it their own way versus waiting on the providence of God. And when I say providence, it means that everything that God is doing to bring about his purposes in this world. And I think as we read through it, we're going to see a lot of ourselves in this. We're going to see how the struggle that continues to happen between us wanting to make a name for ourselves and wanting to do things our way versus humbling ourselves before God and allowing him to do it his way and relying on his gracious providence. So the rest of the book of Genesis is really about how God teaches Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph as men who have been called according to his purpose that he calls them to. Without kind of oversimplifying this, we're going to go through it all as much as we can and talk about how God does this, how God reveals this to us. We're going to see what happens right after the call, beginning in Genesis 12. Now, you remember in Genesis 12, as we talked about it last week, God takes Abram out of the land of Ur, which is basically modern-day Iraq, and he calls him and he says, I'm going to take you to a place where I'm going to show you. And what ends up happening is that he takes him to what this area that is known as Canaan, which is modern-day Israel. It's about a little over 1,200 miles of a journey based on where we think Abram actually ended up in land. It takes him all the way from Iraq to modern-day like Israel, Palestine. About 1,200 miles, halfway from here to New York City. And he takes him on, and of course Abram, he's got all his family, he's got all his livestock, he's got all his workers with him, he's got Lot and all of his people as well. And they make this 1,200-mile journey basically on the back of a donkey through some of the toughest terrain you can imagine, through the desert of the Middle East. And he finally arrives there in Genesis chapter 12. We're in the middle of Genesis chapter 12. And we see that the first thing they do is they set up a settlement. Abram's got a settlement there, and they begin to farm the land, begin to settle it. Basically, they've got a few tents set up at this point. It's a little bit bigger than a campsite, and they begin to settle the land. It's not too long before a famine hits that area. In fact, the famine is so bad that it causes Abram to go down to Egypt to see if he can get some food and some resources for his family. And if you know the story, it's kind of unclear in this situation what Abram should have done. Should he have stayed there in that place that God set him and just waited for God to miraculously provide? Or was it a good idea for Abram to go down to Egypt and to help provide for his family in a different way? We're not really sure, but what we are sure about is that this trip down to Egypt becomes a tremendous failure. Abram follows God out there, he settles, and the first thing he does is he goes down to Egypt. And if you know the story, what's happening here is that Abram goes with his wife Sarai, and he's approaching the city doors and he realizes, hey, you're going to see that you're really beautiful. And she probably looks like, thank you. No. They're going to see that you're really beautiful, and what's going to happen is if they know that I'm your husband, they're going to kill me, and they're going to take you from Pharaoh. So what we need to do is go ahead and tell Pharaoh's men that you're my sister. And that way, they won't kill me. They'll still take you, but they're not going to kill me. Right? And so you see from the beginning, Abram is just completely messing this thing up. Right? God's gone to Abram and he promises him three things. He promises him land, which he's given him. He promises him descendants, which he doesn't have yet. They don't have any kids. And he promises him the blessing. Okay? And so they don't have the descendants yet. And what God has said is, through you, through your offspring, I'm going to bless the rest of the nation. See what Abram's doing? He's short-circuiting God's promise before he gets a chance. They haven't had kids yet, and Abram's ready to give Sarai over to Pharaoh for basically the rest of her life. She becomes a slave in Pharaoh's house, a concubine. And so they get in, and that's exactly what happens. Pharaoh's men notice how beautiful Sarai is. They approach Abram, and he's like, yeah, it's just my sister. Go ahead, take her. And so as a result, Pharaoh gives Abram all this stuff. He's like, well, thank you for giving me your sister as one of my wives that I can add to my harem. And here are some livestock, here are resources, here are food. Go feed your family. God intervenes in that moment, right? God's like, hold on. This is not going to happen. And it's the first example of something that happens over and over again as we look at the lives of the patriarchs. They mess it up. They put this promise at risk. And God is faithful to the promise to intercede and to make sure by his providence that his plan is carried out. And so before Pharaoh can even go in and lay with Sarai, he causes a plague, a series of plagues to hit Egypt. Pharaoh realizes what's going on. He goes to Abram and he's like, why didn't you tell me this was your wife? Get out of here, don't ever come back. So Abram goes back up, he ends up going back to the same place, back up to the area of Canaan. In Genesis chapter 13, they begin to settle. And they settle the land, and in fact, fact, the settlement grows so big that he and Lot kind of start infringing on each other's property. So Lot goes out to the east of the Jordan Valley. Abraham goes west, and he's out towards the West Bank area. Then by Genesis 14, we see the First World War. In fact, it gets so bad, it happens in the Jordan Valley, that Abram has to go and save Lot and his family, and basically pull them out of the war zone, pulls them back to where they're at, and they're living there, and we hit Genesis chapter 15. And that's what we're going to look at this morning as our main text. I got to tell you that Genesis 15 presents to us what is called the Abrahamic covenant. And the Abrahamic covenant echoes and sets the agenda for the rest of the book of Genesis, and I would say even for the rest of the Old Testament on into the New Testament. The Abrahamic covenant is so critically important. That's what Jesus is saying to the Sadducees about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is the promise that God makes to Abraham. This is where it all starts. I want to say a word about covenants if we can. First of all, before we get into it, we're going to be looking at chapter 15 this morning, so go ahead and open your Bibles to that when we read through the entire chapter. But as we look at this, I want to say quickly something about covenants. The word covenant generally means, just in general, the definition for it is an agreement between two parties. But what we see here is biblical covenants are distinctive. They're different than just kind of an agreement between two parties or a contract. Biblical covenants have three things in particular that make them different. So whether it's the covenant that God made with Noah back in Genesis chapter 9, or the covenant that he's going to make here with Abraham in Genesis chapter 15, or the one he makes with David in 2 Samuel 7, or the new covenant that Jesus makes with his disciples. Whatever it may be, these covenants, our God is a covenant-making God. He likes to do this all throughout history, all throughout salvation history. And so he does it in a distinctive way. First of all, when God makes a covenant with people, the covenant is a bond. It shows God's deeply relational connection with humanity that he's making a covenant. God doesn't make covenants outside of relationship. And not only that, but when he makes a covenant, it is an invitation to relationship that's eternal, that doesn't change. Secondly, the covenant, a biblical covenant is established through blood. And what blood shows us is the seriousness of the commitment of the two parties in the covenant. So as these two parties enter into a covenant, the blood of the covenant shows us the permanence and the commitment that the two parties have towards this. What we're going to see in Genesis chapter 15 is actually the slaying and the sacrificing of animals that are placed on either side of the walkway. And the implication is that the two parties who walk through that walkway are saying that I'm committed to agree with this covenant, and if I break my side of the covenant, may what happens to these animals happen to me. In other words, I'd rather die than break the terms of this covenant. So it's established through blood. Thirdly, the covenant is sovereignly administered. This is not the sort of thing where God sits down with human beings and says, okay, let's put together an agreement that we both can put together and we both agree with. God initiates, God establishes, and God is the one who's faithful to carry it through. And so he sits down and he initiates these. It's not between two equal partners, it's actually God saying, this is what the terms of the covenant are. And the great thing about that is that the promise of the covenant doesn't ultimately depend upon humanity's faithfulness to live up to it, but on God's faithfulness to be faithful to his covenant. So let's look at this here. With those three things in mind, this is how God establishes covenants with humanity. We see one here, a very important one in Genesis chapter 15. And it starts here in verse 1. And it says this, after these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Fear not, Abram, I am your shield, your reward shall be very great. Now, why does God lead with, fear not, Abram? He probably understands what's going on in Abram's mind. At this point, Abram's there in the land. He's got the blessing of the land. He's been blessed in general. God's provided for him. God's caused his livestock to grow and all his possessions and that sort of thing. And it's going well for him in the land. But the third aspect of that promise is not there yet. There's no descendant. There's no son. And so Abram starts to get a little bit impatient. And God sees this. And so he comes to him and he says, fear not, Abram, I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. Verse 2 probably doesn't surprise God as far as how Abram responds. He says, O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eleazar of Damascus. And Abram said, behold, you give me no offspring, and a member of my household will be my heir. So what's Abram doing? He's saying that God, you haven't followed through on what you told me you were going to do. So should I just go ahead and do it my way then? I've got an heir in my house, and he's probably not even related to Abram. He's probably just like a house servant or whatever. He's the oldest male. Can I just make him my heir? So you see Abram starting to get impatient with God's promise and with God's timing. And in verse 4, this is how God responds. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him. This man shall not be your heir. Your very own son shall be your heir. And he brought him outside, and he said, look towards the heaven. Number the stars if you are able to number them. And he said to him, so shall your offspring be. And he believed the Lord, and it counted to him as righteousness. Check this out. How God responds, what Abram's probably trying to do, at least as I read this, I don't think I'm alone in this, is Abram's trying to kind of force God's hand. Okay, if it's not going to happen now, please tell me when it's going to happen. Right? All of us want that, right? We feel like we're waiting on God's timing. We're like, okay, you don't have to do it now, God, but just tell me. How long do I have to wait? Is it going to be 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years? I mean, please tell me. And notice that God doesn't oblige. He doesn't tell Abram, oh yeah, this is what's going to happen. It'll happen in 5 years. You can wait and relax until then. He responds by repeating the same promise that he had given to Abram in the first place. And he does this. He takes him out to the stars in the sky and he says, if you can even count these, this is how many descendants, this is how much your offspring is going to be. What's God saying there? Right? I'm going to do even more than you can imagine through this. And it's not going to come from you, it's going to come from me. It's God saying again, this is going to be a miraculous thing. That it will be clear to everybody, including you, that I'm the one who did this. Verse 7. It says, it seems to end well. It says, Abraham believed the Lord. And in verse 7, as God said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of the Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. But he said, oh Lord, how am I to know that I shall possess it? He's still kind of fighting with God there, right? God says, look, Abram, I told you I was going to bring you out of the land of Ur and establish you in this land. I've done it. I've followed through on my promise. Look at what I've done so far. I'm faithful to keep this. You can trust in it. And Abram's like, yeah, what good is the land if I don't have an heir to give the land to? How do I know that I'm going to possess it? And God says, you bring me a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And Abram brought all these, cut them in half, and laid each half over against the other. But he did not cut the birds in half, and when the birds of prey came down on the carcasses, Abram drove them away. So what is God asking Abram to do? Well, we're not sure if God told Abram this is what a covenant looks like, this is how you set it up, or Abram just instinctively knew. But regardless, what's going on here is that Abram's preparing for this covenant ceremony to establish the covenant. Basically to cut 3 animals in half, put half on each side, and to walk through the middle. As we said before, this is the solidifying, the establishing of the covenant. And the idea that if Abram and God are making a covenant together, that Abram and God would walk through this together, saying we are keeping each our side of the covenant. Or else may what happened to these animals happen to us. But as we get to verse 11, it's obvious that God has left and he hasn't come back. Because these animals are out there in the sun long enough that basically vultures come down and try to eat them. Abraham's got to show them the way. We get to verse 12. As the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram. Behold, dreadful and great darkness fell upon him. And the Lord said to Abram, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will make judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. As for yourself, you will go to your fathers in peace, you will be buried in a good old age, and they will come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. There's a couple of things that God's doing here. He predicts for Abram both the captivity of the Israelites in Egypt and the deliverance, what we know as the Exodus. That they'll be in captivity for 400 years, which we know 420 years they're in Egypt, and they're delivered by God's hand out of the Exodus. God's telling Abraham, if you want me to tell you what's going to happen, I can tell you 500 years down the road exactly what's going to happen. Trust me in this. And so God had caused Abram to fall into a deep sleep, and he gives him this vision while he's sleeping. While he's still sleeping, verse 17, when the sun had gone down and it was dark, behold, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between the pieces. In other words, the pieces of animal were there on the ground. Verse 18, on that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your offspring I give this land, the river of Egypt, to the great river, the river Euphrates, and the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites, and any other sites. So basically what he said is essentially what he shows Abram in putting together this covenant and enacting this covenant ceremony is that notice that God is the only one who walks through the middle of this area. Abram's still out. He's still asleep. God's put him out, and he's sitting there seeing visions, and then he maybe wakes up and sees God do this thing, but what happens through this whole thing is that God is making a point to say, the obligation of this covenant falls upon me. He doesn't even have Abram walk through the middle of the path of the animals were dead. He does it himself and on his own by himself, saying, this covenant depends on my faithfulness alone. God takes all the obligations of the covenant that he's making with Abram on himself. And by saying that says, if I break any of these stipulations or promises that I've given to Abram, may death come to me. We all know God can't die. And so the reality of this is the affirmation of Abraham to say, or with Abram to say, this is going to happen. It's as sure as anything you can believe. And so Genesis chapter 15, of course, is this wonderful turning point that God continues to go back to. He goes back to it with Isaac, Abraham's son. He goes back to it with Jacob, Abraham's grandson. And he goes back to it all the way through Israel's history, with the prophets and on into the New Testament. God keeps reminding the Israelites, this is who I am. The God who made a covenant with Abraham, and I will continue to do this thing, to bring it all to fruition. Well, we get to Genesis 15 is a great high point. Genesis chapter 16. You read Genesis chapter 16, you see that although Abram might have been convinced in the moment, we're not sure exactly how much time passes between chapter 15 and 16. When we get to this place where Abram gets impatient again, he still doesn't have a son. It's maybe months, maybe several years after this whole covenant vision has happened with him and God. And he begins to get antsy. He begins to get impatient. He begins to be tempted to take things into his own hands. And so Sarah, his wife, comes to him, and she's probably feeling guilty because being not able to give her husband a son is a very bad thing, especially when God's promised this. And so she probably feels very ashamed of herself and needs actually I think what she's doing when she goes to Abram is she's looking for some support. She's looking for some encouragement. But she goes to him and she says, well, I'm not able to give you a son. Can you want to just try with my housemate? I mean, she's younger than me. She might be able to give you a son. Obviously, I'm not able to do that for you. So do you want to just lay with her and she can give you a son? And Abram, in this moment, this is kind of one of those things where, men, those of you guys who are married, it's like your wife saying, hey, you want to go off on the weekend with the boys? And you know the right answer is no, I don't. I want to stay with you over the weekend, but instead you decide to do it and you pay for it afterwards. Because this is what happens. She goes to him and she says, Abram, you want to go ahead and try with Hagar? And so he does, and his household just erupts in conflict. As a result, Sarah gets upset at Abram, she gets upset at Hagar, and from that point on, this decision that Abram makes to take the promise of God into his own hands and do it his own way causes conflict throughout his entire household. We see it when Ishmael was born, who's the son that he has with Hagar, and we see it when Isaac is born. Isaac and Ishmael don't get along, and that conflict is in many ways still going on today. It becomes an issue of Abram taking things into his own hands, and the result is that there's never peace again in his household. A difficult price to pay, but of course Abram makes this huge mistake. And we get to chapter 17, and God goes back to Abram and repeats the promise again to him, with the mark of circumcision and changing his name from Abram to Abraham. Chapters 18 and 19, God appears to Abraham again, and he says, I'm going to give you a son. And then he goes to Sarai, and changes her name to Sarah, and promises her a son. So by this time next year, you'll have a son. Abraham and Sarah at this point begin to laugh at God, because at this point they are 90, like Sarah's somewhere around 90-something years old, Abraham's about 100 years old. Right? So they laugh at God. They're like, that's ridiculous. There's a 100-year-old man going to impregnate a 90-year-old woman. There's no possible way. God says, why are you laughing at this? This is how I'm doing it. Right? I promised this to you from the beginning, and I'm fulfilling my promise. Into Genesis chapter 20, and I think this story is somewhat out of order, but the story again the story still happens. In Genesis chapter 20, remember how Abraham was so fond in the beginning of kind of giving his wife over to Pharaoh, decided that was a good way to go? You think he would have learned his lesson? Well, he does it again. He does it a second time. And as the story goes, Abraham enters into the city called Gerar, and is there with his wife Sarah, and he goes, hey, remember that thing we did in Egypt? We're going to need to do that again. Just pretend like you're my sister, and the king who's here is going to see that you're beautiful, and so we'll go ahead and just do what we did. It worked out for us last time, so it seems to be the best way to do it. Right? And so he gives his wife into slavery again with this king of England. And she hasn't given birth to a son. And the threat, again, is this threat of the line being preserved for the promised son who's going to come through Abraham and Sarah together. And Abraham's just given it away again. Out of fear, out of saving his own skin, out of deception, whatever it may be, he deceives and he gives his life over to slavery. As a result, God intervenes. He saves again, this time with Abimelech. Abimelech is in a dream that scares him like crazy and causing another sort of plague to happen on the women there in the city. And Abimelech gives Sarah back to Abraham before he can go in and touch her. And so here's this issue again. In Genesis chapter 20, it pops up with Abraham. Here's the thing. If you look at Abraham's life, this is the point. Abraham is a hero of faith, right? He is. Paul uses him as an example both in two different places, at least in Romans and Galatians. James uses Abraham as an example, as a man who was a faithful example. But at the same time, as we look at Abraham's life, there's not a whole lot of faithful examples of behavior going on. He makes mistake after mistake after mistake, and he doesn't seem to learn very well from the mistakes that he does make. Consider just Abraham as a husband. He sold his wife into slavery twice, and he cheated on her by sleeping with her maid. Right? Ladies, I don't care how bad your husband is, probably hasn't done those three things to you. That's a bad example. And those are mistakes that he made. But in the midst of all this, what God is doing through his gracious providence is that he's preserving his promise. And what makes Abraham faithful through this whole thing is not that Abraham is faithful in and of himself, it's that God allows him to be faithful as part of his promise. And God works with him through this process of depending on himself to ultimately depending upon God. And what we see at the very end is this kind of victory that happens at the end of Abraham's life. Genesis chapter 21, Isaac is born, the promised son is born. And after Isaac is only a few years old, he's a young boy at this point, by Genesis chapter 22, we run across this well-known event of the sacrifice of Isaac, at least the staging of the sacrifice of Isaac. God goes to Abraham and he says, I want you to sacrifice your son Isaac. And we're not exactly told why, other than that it was a test. It was a test of Abraham's faith. When we get to the end of the story, we see that what happens is as Abraham gets Isaac up on the altar and he's about to sacrifice him, God intervenes through an angel and then provides a sacrifice there in place of Isaac. And Abraham names that place, the Lord will provide. He's starting to get it. He's starting to understand it by the end of his life. That it doesn't depend on me, that I'm not the one making a name for myself, that God is the one who will make my name for me. That he's the one who will provide, he's the one who will sustain, he's the one who carries all of this by his hand from one event, from 1 year, from one moment to the next. And as we look at Isaac's life, it was a miracle. I think as we look from this perspective of seeing how God did things, the reason why God waited so long for Abraham and Sarah to have this child is because he wanted it undoubtedly to be a miracle of his own hand. For a 90-year-old woman and a 100-year-old man to have a baby, there's no doubt that God was the one who did that. All right, we get to this point and it's clear. It's probably clear to Abraham at this point. So that's why you made me wait so long. Right? If only I would have known that when I was going through this difficulty of trying to trust you through it all. And how much is that like us many times? Right? I know in my own life I've gone through a lot of those situations. I'm like, God, why are you doing this? Why are you allowing this to happen? Why aren't you acting right now? Why aren't you moving? And you get to the end of it and you see the resolution like, oh, so that's why you did it that way. That's exactly what's going on with Abraham in his life by the end. And by the end we get to Genesis 23 through 25. They make up basically the end of Sarah and Abraham's lives. And you see that where we first encounter Abraham in the story, Abraham in the story in Genesis chapter 12, and then the last thing really that we see him doing in Genesis chapter 22, the sacrifice of the attempted sacrifice of Isaac, what we see is that Abraham is ready to give up everything for God. Says God, there are these two amazing examples of obedience that bookend the call that God has put in Abraham's life. In the middle, there's some mess. In the middle, there's some difficulty. In the middle, there's some failure and some frailty. But as we read through the story, as we see the overarching story of Abraham's life, we're encouraged by the end to know that God didn't give up on him. That despite the ways that Abraham did not act in a faithful way, God was still faithful to his promise. It's a tremendous encouragement to us. And as we look through this, guys, the next chapters of 23 through 50 basically incorporate the lives of the stories of Isaac, of course, who was Abraham's son, and then Jacob and Joseph. Jacob was Isaac's son, and then Joseph was Jacob's son. And I'm going to go through about 25 chapters and 300 years of history, about 10 minutes. It's tell you quickly about these men's life. Because I think Abraham sets kind of the story for us. It helps us to see what God's doing. And God says it over and over again. He repeats his promises to Jacob. He repeats his promises to Isaac. And as we get to the end of the book of Genesis, we see that what God had done in Abraham's life, he was very much doing in the same way to the generations of God. Isaac, probably the two biggest things in Isaac's life were his miraculous birth and his miraculous marriage. If you read, of course, we kind of talked about the miraculous birth of Isaac. If you read the story about how Isaac meets his wife, Rebecca, you see it's just this amazing love story that only God could write. God puts it together. So these miraculous two things that keep the line going all the way through, right? This line of descendants that God has promised. The thing with Isaac is that he kind of fails as well. He does the exact same thing that his dad did to his mother. The same story plays out in his life. They walk into a foreign city and he tries to give Rebecca to a foreign king and pass her off as his sister. He does it again. And so you see that he didn't learn from his father's mistakes, and obviously he's still making mistakes of his own. But overall, Isaac's kind of, a very steady, even-handed guy, which puts him in a lot of conflict when he has his son Jacob. Because Jacob and Esau, they're born as twins, but Isaac obviously favors Esau, because Esau's probably a lot more like Isaac. Jacob's a deceiver. He's an ambitious young man, and you can see from the very beginning of the story that he uses deception because he's self-ambitious. Right, one of the great things that Jacob is, as you read Jacob's story, you see that Jacob is very ambitious and he's tenacious. But ambition can be used in the wrong way. And in Jacob's life, as he's a young man, he uses it for his own selfish motives. And so you see deception come out. You see him take advantage of his brother Esau. When Esau's hungry, he comes back from hunting. Jacob's got a nice bowl of stew, and he says, "Give me your birthright," and he gives his bowl of stew. Right, he takes advantage of his brother, and so Esau falls into the trap. And then Jacob tricks Isaac when Isaac's on his deathbed. His father tricks him into blessing Jacob and giving him all the inheritance that was supposed to go to Esau. As a result, conflict erupts. Esau wants to kill Jacob, so Jacob flees and he gets out of it. But God intervenes in Jacob's life to use that same ambition and that same tenacity to be ambitious and tenacious about God's purposes. There are two things that happen in Jacob's life. One, God comes to Jacob in a vision, in a dream, and shows him what's known as kind of Jacob's ladder. Right? It's a picture of a ladder that has its bottom there in the earth, its base in the earth, and it ascends all the way into heaven. And on that ladder, as Jacob sees, are ascending angels up and down. And God says to him, he repeats the very same promise that he gave to his grandfather Abraham. He says, I'm the God who has called you for this, that you and your offspring would be blessed so that you will be a blessing. Repeats the very same thing. And what Jacob sees and what he understands is that there's something special about what God's called him to do. He gets his calling there. And what we see and understand is that picture of Jacob's ladder is a picture of heaven coming to earth in the person of Jesus Christ. It's an amazing thing. It leads all the way. Jacob doesn't see this obviously yet. He realizes that there's something special about what God's called him to do. So that tenacity, that passion, that ambition that Jacob has is now turning towards God's purposes instead of his own selfish motives. The next thing that happens, and of course he names that place Bethel, which means the house of God. The next thing that happens to Jacob is that, again, he's at night somewhere out in the wilderness, and a mysterious man, this figure, begins engaging him in a fight, basically in this wrestling match. And by the end of it, Jacob is tenacious, and he's wrestling with this guy, and they wrestle like all night long, for hours until the sun comes up. And finally, this guy's like, and Jacob recognizes him as some kind of manifestation or representation of God, because he looks at him and he says, I won't let you go until you bless me. And in that time, God renames Jacob to Israel, because as he says, you've wrestled with God, and you have overcome. You recognize that God is here. And so Jacob names that place Peniel, which means the face of God. So those two defining moments of Jacob's life changed Jacob from the self-seeking adolescent young man who wants everything for himself, who is only about what he can grab and how he can deceive others to get what he wants, to now being this ambitious young man who has a passion and a fervor for what God is doing through him. The story moves on, and Genesis closes out with Joseph. When we see Joseph, Joseph is another one of those guys who is really an ambitious young man. He's also very braggadocious, so it's not a surprise in some ways that Jacob actually considers Joseph to be his favorite son. Joseph is the youngest of 12 sons that Jacob has, and he actually becomes his favorite. It says very clearly that Jacob loved Joseph more than he loved any of the other guys, any of his other sons. And so as you can imagine, the other sons knew this as well. And so Joseph had 11 older brothers. As we pick up in the story, Joseph is 17 years old, and he comes to his older brothers, who obviously do not like him because of their father's special affection for this youngest one. And he's probably, because he's like that, he's wearing his little coat of many colors that daddy gave me, and he's running around with this thing, throwing it in his brother's faces. And on top of that, he comes to him one day, and he says, hey, I just had a dream last night. I'm going to be a king, and you guys are all going to be bowing down to me. How do you like that? How about them apples? Right? And it's true. I mean, he actually has that dream. We see that this is the beginning of God giving him a gift to be able to see visions and dreams. It's going to aid him later on in life. But at the same time, he's just this braggadocious 17-year-old that doesn't know what to do with this information other than to get in his brother's faces and tell them, one day I'm going to be the king. You guys are all older than me. You think you're tough. I'm going to be the king. You're going to be bound down to me. And they get upset. And they get all fired up. And he has another dream. And he says, you know what? Not only are you going to bow down to me, but the sun, the moon, and the stars, they're all going to bow down to me as well. And by this time, they're like, this guy, we need to end this guy. We are so tired of him. They get jealous, they get upset, and they're just enraged about what Joseph is doing. And in many ways, Joseph is just asking for it. He's asking for a beatdown. What they want to give him is they actually want to kill him. Reuben, one of Joseph's brothers, stands up for him and says, no, we can't kill him, guys. We can teach him a lesson, but just don't kill him. So what they do is they throw him in a pit while they decide what they're going to do with him, and they end up getting the idea that they'll sell him into slavery. Gets sold into slavery, ends up in Egypt. As a result of that, he's serving at a man named Potiphar's house. Potiphar's wife tries to come on to Joseph. He rejects it, so she turns it on him and accuses him of trying to rape her, and so he's thrown in prison. So you got Joseph, this young man, probably in his early 20s at the most, is now in prison in Egypt, far away from his family, not knowing what's going to happen next. And God causes Pharaoh to start having all these weird dreams. And he can't find anybody who can interpret these dreams except for Joseph. That this gift that God has given Joseph is now used for a purpose. And Joseph ascends from being a prisoner to a man that Pharaoh trusts, to a man that Pharaoh likes, putting him second in command in Egypt, only to Pharaoh himself. How can you imagine that? A Hebrew guy, foreign guy, is put in charge or second in command of the biggest empire at the time. And so what happens as a result is that, Jacob, if you know the story, Jacob's family, the land that they're living, they have a severe famine. They have to go to Egypt again to beg for some food and see what resources they can get. And what happens is that God uses Joseph's position to bring all the fathers of the 12 tribes of Israel into Egypt to provide for them, to establish them, and it sets the stage for what becomes the Exodus, where God establishes a people and a nation for himself, and then brings them out of Egypt back into the promised land. So as you see this story play out, God's fingerprints of providence are all over it. If we were to write this story, and we were to say, okay, this is the ending, this is the beginning, now write in the middle of it, go ahead and write out in the middle of it what it would look like, we would never imagine that this would happen in a million years. But the way that God does it is he works with all of humanity who make mistakes over and over again. He doesn't abandon us, never give up on us. He provides his providential grace in our lives. So as we look at this, guys, there are a few things, a few lessons we can learn from this. First of all, is that God chooses humanity as a central part of his mission. I got to be honest, if you read through the book of Genesis, one of the things that I felt is, why did God just give up? I mean, after Abraham took his wife to a foreign city, tried to sell her as a slave for the second time, why did God just say, all right, I'll do it, guys, I'm just going to do this. I don't need humanity to get this done. I can do it on my own. Which is true, he does it, but he chooses to continually use humanity through all of this. And it's an amazing thing, as what we see, of course, is that the result of it all is Jesus himself tabernacling among us at the beginning of the Gospels of the New Testament. There's a reason that God uses humanity as a central part of his mission. And because he uses us, he brings his chosen people that he chooses gracious providence. We talk about discipleship and spiritual growth a lot as Christians. I think as we see these men's lives in Genesis and the way that God deals with them, we see exactly what spiritual growth is supposed to look like. God breaks them from depending upon themselves to a slow process of depending more and more upon God. And for some people, spiritual growth becomes this aspect of enlightenment. Right? I get to a place where functionally I'm wise and I know enough about the Bible and I know enough about spiritual things that I really don't need God. And as Christians, we probably wouldn't say that, but some of that attitude creeps into the church. It's basically New Age garbage, but some of that belief creeps into the church from time to time. We get to a point where we feel like, I know the Bible so much that I really don't need God. We don't say that, but functionally that's how we live. What this shows us is that spiritually, real spiritual growth and discipleship shows us that the more and more we grow, the more and more we realize our need for dependence on Him. It's that whole thing about, the more you know, the more you realize you don't know. That's what it's like to grow as a Christian. The more we know, the more we grow, the more we realize that we need to be even more and more dependent upon God than we were before. That's what we see here is God's gracious providence. And as He deals with Abraham and the patriarchs, it's a continual demonstration of God's goodness and faithfulness. He says to them repeatedly, and He says to us over and over again, I am good, I can be trusted, you can trust me. Which means, of course, the third thing we learn is that God can really be trusted. The patriarchs, they left a legacy of faith, but they only left a legacy of faith because God was faithful to them. And their stories become really what God has done from one generation to the next. We look at these guys and we call them heroes of faith, but the real hero of the story is God Himself. He's the one doing this through these guys. Fourth, it all depends on God. We look at the life of Abraham and the patriarchs of Israel. He said it's a flawed humanity that God uses. But Joseph says one of the great statements about, I think, helps sum up the entire book of Genesis for us. When he confronts his brothers, he looks at them and he says, what you intended for evil against me, God meant for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Joseph gets to this point in his life where he's able to look back and he's able to see, I went through all this junk. And a lot of it, some of it I probably deserved, some of it I didn't. But it doesn't matter because what had been meant for evil has now been redeemed for good, and now God is using that and using that. I think that's a great statement for the Christians. We apply this to our lives. It's all about our lives being a process of learning to trust God, to depend on His grace, and to follow His providential action. What Joseph said right there is a great statement for the Christians, that what was originally intended for evil, what was evil in my life, has now been changed, that God has used for good. And what you see happening in my life is now the result of that, the saving of many lives. So God saves us so that we can be a blessing. We're blessed so that we can be a blessing. God seeks us and saves us so that He can send us out according to His saving purposes. Guys, we're in the middle of what started in Genesis chapter 12, salvation history, continues on beyond us to Revelation chapter 22, which puts us squarely in the middle of God's salvation history. Right? When you read Revelation 21 and 22 hasn't happened yet. We look forward to that happening, but in the meantime, we're right in the middle of God's salvation history. So that what He redeems that was bad, that was evil in our lives, that He makes good, He uses to save lives. He uses to draw people to Himself. And we pull it out, guys, I think as we get to the end of Genesis and we reflect on the providential action of God and the grace that's there, we tend as people to have to fight that. Fight that same urge, that same sort of temptation that the patriarchs fought. Is that when God doesn't do things the way we want, or when it doesn't seem like things are playing out the way that they should, or the way that we would do them, our tendency is to want to make a name for ourselves, rather than allow God to make a name for us, so to speak. And so we read, I think when I read this, one of the verses that came to mind as I got to the end of this study was Romans 8. Romans 8, chapter 8, verse 28. That and realizing that God works all things together for those who love Him and are called according to His purpose. We say that a lot. But here's the thing, is that promise doesn't go out for everyone. It's not for everyone who just attends church. It's not for everybody who's a good person. It says for those who love Him and are called according to His purpose or His mission. What we learn here is that being called to God's mission is both the most dangerous and safest place that we can be. It's dangerous if you want to hold on to yourself. It's dangerous if you want to make a name for yourself. But it's safe if we are relying on God to make a name for us this week. We're relying on God to bring His purposes together. And so we tend to believe that, guys, we're much more in control of our world than we really are. The reality of it is that God's bringing it all according to His purpose. As we see this calling of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then Joseph, how it plays out. Again, it's not something that we would write ourselves. But if we have the perspective to be able to see God is doing, it informs everything else that we do in our lives. And no matter where you are, God is forming you for less dependence on yourself and more dependence on Him. That's what spiritual growth is all about. And as He works in this early family, He's blessing them so that they then can be a blessing. The order of that is intentional. God blesses them, in other words, He changes them, He transforms them in this very first family, like these first patriarchs, so that He can prepare them to be Israel, which this nation becomes a blessing, was supposed to become a blessing. We'll see kind of the mixed result of that But let's pray together, guys. Let's pray about that in particular.